Hello, folks. We've got a few people just joined us, and we'll give 30 seconds for other people to join before we start. Okay, I think we'll just start from here, and if other people join, then we'll catch them up as we go. So I'm just gonna share a screen so you can see some of the content on there. And first thing to say is just welcome. It's really good to have people along to think about an important topic. So thanks for taking the time to consider this. So my name's Andy. I'm a forensic psychotherapist and a clinical supervisor. I'm a registrant of the British Psychoanalytic Council and a senior accredited member of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. I'm the clinical director of Lifelink, which has a 30-year history of delivering NHS commissioned services, school counselling and therapeutic services in the prison estate, all commissioned, and also of Lifelink Workwell, which is our social enterprise offering commercial mental health reflective practice and neurodiversity services, as well as mental health consultancy and training, including suicide prevention training. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to sort of meet some of you maybe in this kind of digital space. But to get into the talk a bit, this talk isn't about me and it isn't about Workwell per se, except that, to some degree it is, because I'm at work right now and I'm working for Workwell. So it kind of is about those things. But who am I when I'm at work? Do I become someone different or not? And if you think maybe I do, or even that I should, then perhaps you're right. Maybe you get me playing a role, acting or performing in a different way to the way we usually understand performance in the workplace. Maybe more like theatre, where we imagine a character and then do our best to act out the way we think that character would behave to really convince an audience. But if I'm allowed or even encouraged to be more of myself at work, it's likely that I'll feel better in all sorts of ways. So maybe here's piece number one of audience participation. Think for a moment for yourself, if you're really honest. How much as a percentage would you say you're able to be yourself at work? So just ponder that for a moment. How much are you able to be yourself at work? And then, of course, for some of you, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, I need to figure out how to be more of myself all of the time before I can apply a portion of that to the workplace persona that I bring. So that's really important to recognize, to understand how to be ourselves. What does that exactly mean? And it's not a straightforward process in the first place. So I'm going to try and explain and expand on some of those ideas over the course of the next half an hour or so. Before we get into there, I think it would be helpful to think about the current situation for mental health care just for a moment. So the current model of mental health care is run on a neoliberalist, read capitalist principles of highest efficiency and productivity for lowest cost. So hospitals are managed by project managers and very rarely doctors or clinicians. If you require support for mental health, there is a somewhat messy view of what is actually helpful. Distress is unique, obviously. So I actually think it's really hard to generalize approaches that will work at a population level. Nevertheless, that's what's been attempted. So I don't want this to become too political, but in some ways it's hard to avoid, as I'm sure you can understand. But in the same vein, almost everyone who approaches the NHS for support with mental health is currently offered some form of CBT. Usually in England, that would be through the IAPT service, the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. So what does all that mean? Well, CBT meets the requirements of efficiency and productivity very neatly by being designed to be quite quick, highly structured and manualized, which means that forms of it can be delivered by people with minimal training and therefore also relatively cheap. Farad Dalal's book is entitled The Cognitive Behavioral Tsunami: Managerialism, Politics, and the Corruptions of Science. In the book, he says that CBT psychology has fetishized measurement to such a degree that it has come to believe that only the accountable counts. He suggests that the so-called science of CBT is not just bad science, but corrupt science. And I'm not personally anti-CBT at all. There are many, many highly skilled and effective CBT therapists, many of whom are colleagues of mine. But my view is that it's important to adopt a critical view of anything that becomes relied upon as a panacea, or anything that suggests it can be all things to all people and rejects the need to invest in any meaningful alternative, which is the current situation we find ourselves in. According to a King's College London study, 82% of us say that mental health is as important as physical health, but only 20% of people think that the healthcare system treats it that way. What we know about men is that they generally die earlier, become ill at a younger age, and develop more chronic illnesses than women do. And despite these health concerns, men are also up to 50% less likely to seek medical attention than women, which is a complex issue in itself. So based on all of this and what I said in the last slide, employers would be safe to assume that men broadly aren't getting the help that they need. They're adrift, often feeling very alone and overwhelmed and helpless with their distress. So when things get bad, rather than looking to book an appointment, even in 3 months' time with their GP to request support, or go and meet some friends, talk it out and have a good cry, because that's very scary, the way it can manifest in the workplace and what managers are likely to see is the list at the top here. Non-compliance, absenteeism, poor conduct, addiction, disruption, low productivity, etc. So perhaps the first supportive thing that can happen is an honest, an honest, compassionate conversation with a manager, exploring some of the roots of the behaviors that are being observed in the workplace and considering the most appropriate options. So it could be that you're offering someone sick leave or compassionate leave. It could also be that you're offering to support someone through an EAP service, an employee assistance program, if you have one of those. Again, EAPs tend to be aligned with the managerial principles of efficiency. So you'd likely get offered maybe 4 sessions, 6 if you're lucky. But if you'd like to think more about a different kind of approach, maybe a more sensitive and thoughtful approach for how you offer therapeutic support in your workplace, then that's something you can talk to Workwell about, and we can try and explore a better solution, which isn't just a tick box for the HR department. But without these conversations, or even with them in a workplace, perhaps, there are some options that I think men have in the world. And I've just given 5 of them here. I think there probably are more than 5, but these are the ones. And that I've come up with for this presentation. So, men who aren't getting the support they need have some options. Get on with it, avoid it, have a breakdown, disappear, which can include suicide, or seek support. But obviously seeking support, we've already realized, is not really an option for many men. So how do people make a decision about which of these options they think is right for them? How do they make a decision about which direction they turn when things get really tough? Well, I think that question is helpfully answered if we think about where do we begin. So it's very much dependent on some of the things we think about when we go back into our childhood and our early life. So let's take a moment to remind ourselves. In attachment theory, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth give us a really clear model of how what happens in our earliest relationships can impact us throughout our lifetime. So with particular attention paid to how we form relationships with our primary caregivers, usually our parents, but also what else that has an impact on in terms of who we become. The factors that have an influence on who we become are multifaceted. there are biological, psychological, and social factors that are all enmeshed, which form how we develop and who we become. And, just from this list here, which is non-exhaustive, we've gone beyond the question of nature or nurture in terms of how people develop. And now I think it's fairly widely understood to be a lot of both. So when we're attempting to manage all of those things all of the time, it can be pretty overwhelming and can cause a lot of tension. So how do we, but particularly, well, how does anyone, but particularly men, manage the tension and stress and the emotional fallout that can bring? So the task we started asking the question about at the beginning is figuring out, who am I in this world? And how do I be myself? And what does myself mean? And this adds a layer of complexity, which is, who am I according to all these factors and influences in the world? And how do I get to decide any of who I become? The expectations on men in our current societal situation also leaves impossible dilemmas, contradictory demands, and external pressures that we know cause internal distress. And we find that we're holding ourselves to standards that are based on beliefs that are related to unrealistic idealization and downright fantasy. So how do men process distress, the distress that is inevitably around? Generally speaking, as we've alluded to, men don't do a great job at managing that distress. At the moment, current statistics suggest that the most dangerous thing to a man under 50 years of age living in the UK is himself. It's the biggest killer of suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50 years of old in the UK. And yet many suicides, there is very limited or no indication prior to receiving the devastating news. We may all be aware of some suicides that have occurred in very famous individuals, very public-facing individuals, comedians like Tony Hancock, Robin Williams, musicians like Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, Keith Flint from The Prodigy, all the way to fashion guru and icon Alexander McQueen, and many, many more. And just a word on language here, so that you can be part of the thoughtful, a part of being thoughtful about this going forward. The current thinking has moved away from the term committing suicide, which relates to the historical association with two things really: religious sin and also crime, when it was illegal to have taken your own life. All the way up until 1961, that would have been illegal. So the current language that's encouraged is either that someone has died by suicide or completed suicide, and sometimes someone has taken their own life might be appropriate too. But coming back to the fundamental question, why? What is happening to these men who don't feel able to continue with the way things are? So I think it's helpful to consider the environment for a second. We've evolved through generations with a much steadier, more gradual pace of change, in which roles in communities, mostly delineated by birth sex, were much more clearly defined and can still be broadly observed in many communities around the world. Three tasks that men were usually ascribed were protect, provide, procreate. I'm not saying they're always good models, but the definition of role, value, and status was clearer then than it is now in our Western post-industrial, ultra-convenient, highly technologically advanced society. So the question is, what is this doing to people, but particularly to men? The fact is, we don't need other people for these things anymore. We have Ring doorbells, Uber Eats, and artificial insemination, or adoption if you prefer. So what is the role of a modern man? And how have we come to understand that? In what ways does the modern workplace help or hinder that situation? That's another question I think that's really important to consider here. At some point, work meant activity related to survival and subsistence, with infinite variables to adapt to and contend with the required attention and skills which correlated to our ability to survive. Now our attention is absolutely flooded by things that have no relationship to our physiological survival. So how do we understand the function of the work that we do when it's no longer so closely linked to a clear purpose? The modern world is now mostly immaterial. The modern workplace is mostly immaterial in the sense that, we make money to survive. We don't make things to help us survive. So is it surprising that there's a crisis of purpose and fulfillment when for many, it just isn't clear what they're doing for work, apart from to pay the bills or upgrade the telly, or maybe go to a slightly nicer Airbnb next time they go away for a city break? So how do we as men tie that to an embodied genetic and cultural understanding and experience of masculinity? Well, I think it's really hard. And I think what happens is that we get polarized. And in the middle of this polarization, we have a very confused state about what masculinity is, more so possibly than ever before. It's good to be questioning these things. It's good to be thinking about these things. But the current trends see more and more polarization in so many aspects of society. Melanie Klein would call this paranoid schizoid thinking, where things are either good or bad, idealized or denigrated, with no gray area with which to think about something having the potential to be both good and bad, perhaps not at the same time. It's hard to imagine the same thing being satisfying and disappointing, frustrating and exciting, but it must be possible. So instead of reaching this middle ground through a mature appreciation of the outside external reality, we experience this confusion, this conflict. Which should I be? As if the only options are one polarity or the other. I must be misogynistic, aggressive, egotistical, and unemotional, or submissive, impotent, and subdued. I represent a narcissistic perversion of masculine worth, such as the Andrew Tates of the world, or I distance myself from the worth my masculinity could offer by rejecting it entirely. Of course, that's not universally true, and there are many people who manage to find a balance with something of their masculine identity, but the polarization is becoming more apparent. So to deal with that polarization and the conflict that people feel left with, the push-pull of these polarities, here are some examples of go-to options to defend against those feelings of confusion that probably all sound relatively familiar. They give distance from the emotional and the psychological dissonance and distress. So the questions are, really for yourself to say, I know or have myself used one of these defenses, or I know someone that has. And the one that I'm most familiar with. So which one of these defenses might be familiar to you? Which area do you see yourself kind of going to as a way of defending against some of the difficulties that you might experience? And if you don't recognize something, that's absolutely fine. If you don't think you fit into any of these boxes, that's all right. It's not about trying to fit people into boxes. It's about recognizing that there are common ways in which people find to cope with some of those difficulties. And there are others. So the current approach, as we've said, puts the problem with the individual. Okay, so the question is, do we have a mental health tsunami, a suicide epidemic, a well-being crisis, or maybe do we have a reasonable psychological response to a really difficult environment? So Rishi Sunak's implied answer to the sick note culture is to tell us that we should be the ones that should be building resilience. We should be less emotional. We should maybe be more grateful for what we have, which is fine for those of us that can recognize the privileges we've been afforded. But the message is ultimately, man up, do better. And when we do recognize that perhaps it's something about the environment we've created, when do we recognize that it's something about the environment we've created? So since this is about supporting men in the workplace, the question could be then for you as the audience, what kind of a workplace culture can be an antidote or a toxin in this situation? So again, have a think about that for a moment. What is my workplace culture? Is the culture at my workplace an antidote or a toxin to this situation? Another book called The Burnout Society by Han, who's a philosopher. Um, he suggests that we're driven by the demand to persevere and not to fail, as well as by the ambition of efficiency, as I've mentioned. We become committers and sacrificers at the same time and enter a swirl of self-exploitation and eventual collapse. And then we're back into defending against this imminent collapse using the list of defenses, perhaps from a couple of slides ago. So at this point, I want to shift our attention somewhat. I want to turn to a Scottish psychiatrist who was around in the 1930s called Ian Suttie. He suggested an idea that he described as a taboo on tenderness. So in 1935, in his classic work, The Origins of Love and Hate, Suttie argues that a repression of tender feelings is endemic at all levels of cultural life. The taboo on tenderness limits manifestations of love and affection and rationalizes away those sentiments that do manage to find expression. A close colleague of mine called Tilly, who may be in the room, not sure, describes the scene of two men hugging, maintaining that unwritten law of keeping their groins 6 inches apart, which always made me chuckle. The fear of intimacy is real in men. The fear of intimacy with other men and the potential for that to be confused with sex and sexuality is real in men. And where do we learn that? Predominantly, I think we learn that from other men. It's conditioned into us from infancy. And a very effective solution is to remove the risks associated with intimacy, real intimate human connection, by replacing it with AI, or as we're calling it now, artificial intimacy. And what I mean by that is pornography, social media, online gaming, AI therapy, AI partners, AI artificial intelligence, I mean, in that context, and online dating apps. They're a very effective and efficient way of removing that risk from true intimacy. So for many of us in the room, for any of us in the room who are familiar with Freudian ideas, don't worry, we're not going to talk about Oedipus today, although we can talk about that another day. But Freud might have thought about this as a tension between Eros and Thanatos, life and death, creativity and destruction. So, for example, if my perhaps unconscious desires are rejected or unacceptable in this relationship, then perhaps the only solution is to destroy the relationship. And perhaps the only way to really guarantee the destruction of the relationship for both of us is to destroy myself, which might be a way people find themselves looking at suicide as the only option that feels possible. So what do we need to do? We need to create safe spaces for men to explore and understand these aspects of their masculinity, which I would say includes intimacy, sexuality, tenderness, and sensitivity, without fear of judgment. We need to create spaces for men to think about the tension and confusion and the shame that they carry, creating spaces to think about and reflect on the complex task of maleness, which can allow some of that tension to dissipate. Acknowledging the shared struggle, the shared task of becoming loving and lovable, is one of the most major tasks, I think, for men in our society today. I want to make a quick shout out here to Andy's Man Club, who offer nationwide spaces of this nature. I believe they hold sessions every Monday night at 7 p.m. and you can check out their website to find your nearest club. And it's nothing to do with me. It just happens to be called Andy's Man Club, named after a young man who lost his life to suicide. So really what I'm saying is that we need to tip the balance from a reliance on this artificial intimacy and the resultant shame to a place of offering empathy and allowing vulnerability in exploring and redefining masculinity in modern society and the modern workplace, to create a culture that has can be an antidote to these impossible expectations. So I think a good example is Peter Parker. So my question to you is, how does Peter Parker become Spider-Man? What happens in this transformational process? So Peter Parker goes on a journey. He endures adversity and he realizes and accepts his worth. And he begins to embrace what he can offer, his potency, his power. There are many other examples that we could draw from here, but essentially what we're talking about is the hero's journey. The archetype of the hero in many stories is very identifiable. And there is for sure hardship and jeopardy and risk involved in making these journeys. Numbing, anesthetizing, and avoiding and defending against emotional pain are often preferable to taking that journey with all the unknowns that come with it. Think about Spidey facing down the Green Goblin. It's important for all of us to get back in touch with the struggles that we face. It might hurt and it might feel at times like we're a bit beat up by the process, like it will never get easier. But offering someone a space to hurt, to work through that pain and emerge from it with a renewed understanding of their place in the world takes time, and it takes care. And it takes a trusting relationship, often one that can be found with a therapist. So I would encourage you to consider your company's stance around access to and availability of therapy. And I don't mean that 4-session EAP model I mentioned earlier. I mean something that doesn't just provide a tokenistic tick box for your people policies. I mean access to something more regular, perhaps longer term, with a whole raft of wellbeing support behind it for all people, but perhaps particularly men who could really do with it. And this is really important, particularly for those of you who might be thinking right now, it won't work where I work. Those are the workplaces that really need this kind of intervention. So how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. So we spend approximately a third of our lives at work, another third asleep, and only about a third of our life is really our own. So as I'm starting to think about wrapping things up here, there's no profound statements to end on. There's no way to tie this up in a nice, neat bow. All I can do really is hope that something about what I've said today has resonated, and where appropriate, you think about what kind of action in whatever place you work, with whatever influence you might have, is in your gift to do as much as possible to alleviate the emotional suffering that I've attempted to highlight a bit today. And as I've said, it's not a light-hearted subject, but the question might be, is there hope? Is there hope around for you? Is there hope around for you around how men journey through and into a sense of masculinity that can be constructive and potent and valued? And maybe a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, but does that hope come from a government's suicide prevention strategy? The government have had this on their radar for a while, which is great. And I can't imagine a new government moving too far away from something like this. But personally, I'm also not going to wait around for the government to a strategy to have the impact that we hope it might. Personally, I'm going to be seeking out ways that I can do something, even quite small things, where I'm at now, to support these principles: improving data and evidence, providing tailored support, addressing common risk factors, providing effective support, particularly at crisis, and providing, a destigmatizing approach to suicide wherever possible. So I would leave you with that question. What are the ways you in your organization can improve your approach to all of these things in this list? And the government said so. So you've got a good justification to take back into your workplace and try to improve things um, if you can. And this can be an overwhelming topic, a bit like climate crisis or war. Mental health is another of the huge challenges we face collectively. So collective action is incredibly important. But one of the things that can combat overwhelm and burnout is reclaiming some personal agency in the present moment. So maybe some of those questions aren't even about what you do in your workplace for others, not yet anyway. Maybe it's about right now, how do you take responsibility for keeping yourself well, just for today, just you? How do you or could you model a way of caring for your own mental health that somebody else might observe and get curious about? If everyone here today decided that that was what was important, then I think that would be a good outcome. I'm just going to finish with a 1 minute video that I think really powerfully captures some of the themes that I've been talking to. So I'm just going to share my sound and then play the video.
Yeah, things are good. Got a job, got a girlfriend, got a little boy. I never let him go through what I went through. Still having the nightmares though. But my anger's under control. I trust people more. I'm getting a bit better now. You know, it's like I can see a way out. Well, that one from Bernardo's alright. We talk a lot. And I trust her. Everyone else could just do one.
Woman from Bernardo's doesn't give up. Keeps asking why I nick stuff. Do drugs, hit people. I told her where to go. Told my foster parents where to go. Just like the last ones. Don't trust no one. I ain't changing.
They laughed at me at the bus stop. Said I was thick. Won't say that again.
Mommy's boyfriend hates me. I tried hard, but he always finds me. I'm scared.
So for me, that's pretty hard hitting, and we might all recognize parts of ourselves that identify with the scared little boy in some context or other. And depending on the response we got at the time from the people around us, we will have had an influence on who we became as adults and who we have become as men. So was it an arm around the shoulder and a reassuring word, or was it a clip around the head and a telling off? Or was it met with silence and despondency? Whatever your experience, it will have had some influence over how we learn to deal with adversity. And we may well host another session on adverse child experiences or ACEs at some point. But to finish, I would just encourage you to do to try and see that little boy in all the men we encounter at work or anywhere who might appear outwardly to be angry or suicidal or depressed, and think about how the response we offer in that moment might influence their decisions going forward. And perhaps your response could show them a different message to the ones they've received earlier in life. Perhaps the message could be that being a man can include compassion and care and connection, that intimate connection that doesn't have to be pushed away. And maybe the way we do that might determine some of the next steps potentially for those individuals, maybe towards hope rather than despair in those moments. So that's the end of the content for just now, and you know, I would encourage you to get in touch with Lifelink Workwell if you have any questions about ways that we could support your workplace. And also, please scan the QR code on the slide just now to leave some feedback about the session, how you found it, whether it was helpful and informative, or whether there were other topics you would like us to cover as well. And as I said, if there's anything that's touched you or impacted on you emotionally, please do reach out for support. The number for Samaritans is up there just now, but you know, there's also other ways that you could do that. Yeah, please do that for yourself. So I'll leave that slide up there for just a moment. And I'm just going to check in with any questions that might be there. If there are questions, feel free to pop them into the chat or in the Q&A session just now. And I can have a look at those. And if there aren't, then that's okay. We can take a bit of time to just reflect on the content and end it there. If you do have any questions that occur to you later on or afterwards, then feel free to look me out on LinkedIn or drop an email to the Lifelink Workwell email address, which is up there, and I'll be able to come back to you. And as I said, if you have colleagues who maybe weren't able to attend today and you think this would be interesting or informative for them, then feel free to share the YouTube channel with them, and they'll be able to see this recording. I think for now, though, we'll say thank you very much for taking your time out this afternoon, and yes, we look forward to engaging with you further in the future. Thanks very much, everyone.